When we begin to talk about fasting in the context of Watchman Nee's life and teaching, we must first pause and consider the man himself. For many, his name carries with it an aura of mystery and authority, not because he sought it, but because of the weight of his spiritual experience. Watchman Nee was not a theoretician of faith, he was a practitioner, one who lived the truths he spoke. His writings and sermons were never meant to be ornamental theology, but rather practical pathways into the depths of the Christian life. To understand his perspective on fasting, we must begin by understanding his larger vision of the Christian journey. He lived in a time of great upheaval in China, a time when both political and cultural forces were tearing at the fabric of society. In such an environment, shallow faith was easily exposed, and only a deep, disciplined spirituality could endure. Nee's ministry was shaped by this reality. His emphasis was never on building outward institutions or movements, but on cultivating an inward reality of life in Christ. He often warned against the danger of external show, of practicing religion without transformation. It is in this context that his approach to fasting becomes significant. For him, fasting was not primarily about denying the body, it was about positioning the spirit. He did not regard it as a ritual to prove one's holiness, nor as a badge of spiritual superiority. Instead, fasting was a tool, one among many, for breaking the dominance of the natural man, so that the inner life of Christ could find freer expression. In this way, his thought connects closely with the psychological and philosophical question of mastery. Who governs the human being? Is it the body, with its appetites and demands? Is it the soul, with its restless emotions and wandering thoughts? Or is it the spirit, that deepest faculty where the divine and human may meet? Nee's teaching consistently returned to this central question: which part of you is truly in control? He often spoke of the necessity of dealing with the self, with the stronghold of the natural life, so that the believer might walk in the reality of resurrection life. Fasting, then, was one of the hidden disciplines he considered most effective in bringing the believer to this confrontation. It silences the body, unsettles the soul, and creates space for the spirit to ascend. It is not comfortable, nor is it meant to be. It is disruptive. And yet, in the disruption, something remarkable can occur, the recognition that life is not sustained by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from God. What makes this especially striking is that Nee rarely broadcasted these teachings to the masses. He was selective, careful, even guarded. He understood that fasting, like prayer, can easily be distorted into performance. A discipline meant to liberate can become a new form of bondage if the motive is wrong. That is why he often reserved these deeper practices for disciples who had already demonstrated a genuine hunger for God. To give such tools indiscriminately, he believed, would only lead to misuse. In this we see not elitism but wisdom. He discerned that fasting is not a starting point for the casual seeker, but a refining fire for the committed disciple. From a psychological perspective, we can see why he would take this approach. Fasting strips away comfort. It confronts us with our dependence. For the unprepared, it can generate frustration, pride, or even despair. But for the one who is ready, it becomes a mirror, reflecting back the degree to which one's identity and stability are grounded in physical satisfaction rather than spiritual reality. Nee understood this deeply, and he invited his disciples to see fasting not as a punishment of the body, but as a revelation of the heart. What surfaces in the absence of food? Irritation, anger, fear, pride. All these hidden currents come rushing to the surface, and once exposed, they can be dealt with in the light of God. Philosophically, this reflects an ancient principle that freedom is not achieved by indulging desire, but by mastering it. Watchman Nee echoed this truth in his own way, showing that spiritual freedom comes not from yielding to every appetite, but from learning to let go of them when necessary. This is not suppression, but liberation. To fast is to remind the body that it is not the master. To fast is to remind the soul that its emotions do not govern reality. To fast is to place the spirit in its rightful position of leadership. And so, when we speak of fasting in Nee's teaching, we are not speaking of an optional side practice, but of something integral to his vision of Christian maturity. It was hidden not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important to be trivialized. He entrusted it only to those who would treat it with reverence. This was not secrecy for its own sake, it was stewardship of a sacred discipline. As we reflect on this, the lesson for us is clear. Fasting is not about denying ourselves food for the sake of tradition or appearance. It is about facing the reality of who is truly in control within us. It is about learning, through discipline, to yield to the higher life of the Spirit. And it is about creating space for God to move in ways that comfort often conceals. If Watchman Nee could speak to us now, perhaps he would remind us of a simple truth. The body is a servant, not a master. The soul is a vessel, not a throne. And the Spirit, when united with Christ, is meant to govern them both. To fast is to set this order right again. And so I leave you with this. Fasting is not ultimately about what you give up, but about what you discover. If we have understood something of the context in which Watchman Nee spoke, then the next step is to ask a simple but essential question. Why fasting at all? What is its purpose? What does it accomplish that prayer alone, or study alone, or service alone cannot? For Nee, the answer lay in the profound recognition that fasting is not about the absence of food, but the presence of God. It is never an end in itself, but always a means to an end, an instrument designed to reorder the interior life. When he spoke about fasting, Nee often pointed his disciples away from the physical dimension and toward the deeper issue of dependence. The body is sustained by food, yes, but life itself is not sustained by food alone. Life, he reminded them, comes from God. And this is where the purpose of fasting becomes clear. It is a deliberate act of dependence, a way of saying with both body and spirit that God, not bread, is the true source of life. In the simplest terms, fasting is a living confession. It is a testimony, not to others but to ourselves, that our hunger for God must surpass our hunger for comfort. This understanding reveals why fasting carries such weight. For many, the appetites of the body, whether food, pleasure, or comfort, become the hidden masters of life. They dictate mood, shape decisions, and even define identity. What happens when the body is denied its usual satisfactions? Suddenly, its power is exposed. The irritations, the cravings, the restless anxieties, they all surface, and the believer is faced with the stark truth of who is really in control. Fasting becomes the mirror of mastery, reflecting back the subtle tyrannies that normally go unnoticed. From a psychological perspective, this is fascinating. Modern thought often frames hunger as a purely biological signal, something to be satisfied immediately. But Nee would argue that hunger can also be a spiritual signal, a pointer toward the deeper hunger embedded in every human soul. The hunger of the stomach is temporal, the hunger of the spirit is eternal. Fasting exposes this distinction in a way few other practices can. It brings the surface-level appetites into conflict with the deeper longings, and in that clash, the believer is invited to realign his or her priorities. Notice here that Nee did not encourage fasting for the sake of ascetic pride. He was wary of legalism. He knew that a person could fast rigorously and still remain inwardly bound, still full of pride, still caught in the illusion of self-sufficiency. The purpose was never to punish the body, nor to showcase discipline, but to open space for God's transforming presence. He warned against approaching fasting as a work to earn spiritual merit. For him, fasting was a posture of surrender. It was not about proving strength, it was about confessing weakness. And here lies the paradox. By confessing weakness through fasting, one actually discovers strength, not the brittle strength of willpower, but the enduring strength that comes from reliance on God. When the body is silenced, the spirit begins to speak with greater clarity. When the appetites are subdued, prayer rises with greater urgency. This is the secret power of fasting, and it explains why Nee valued it so highly. It is a discipline that removes noise, clears space, and amplifies the still small voice that so easily gets lost in the clutter of daily life. Philosophically, this reflects a principle as old as human thought, that freedom comes not from yielding to desire, but from transcending it. The Greeks spoke of self-mastery, the mystics spoke of detachment, Watchman Nee spoke of the breaking of the outer man so that the inner life of the spirit might be released. Though the language differs, the truth remains consistent. Fasting is not a withdrawal from life, but an entry into life at a deeper level. By abstaining from what is temporary, one awakens to what is eternal. It is important to emphasize, too, that Nee saw fasting as inseparable from prayer. One without the other is incomplete. Fasting without prayer is mere hunger strike. Prayer without fasting often lacks the intensity born of sacrifice. But together they form a synergy. The emptying of the body prepares the soul to receive, and the act of prayer fills the vacuum with divine reality. In this way, fasting becomes not simply the absence of food, but the presence of communion. So we see that the purpose of fasting, for Watchman Nee, was always relational. It was about drawing closer to God, about stripping away every false reliance, about confronting the illusions of self-sufficiency and finding in their place the sufficiency of Christ. It was not designed for show, not intended to impress others, but meant to cultivate a secret intimacy with God that could withstand both trial and temptation. And perhaps this is the point where we must reflect most deeply. What are we depending on? What holds our lives together when circumstances collapse? For most, it is comfort, routine, food, or distraction. Fasting cuts through these supports and asks us to face the raw truth. When all is taken away, is God enough? That is the question at the heart of this discipline, and it is the question that every disciple of Christ must answer, whether through fasting or through the trials of life itself. Watchman Nee would not have us take fasting lightly, nor would he have us avoid it out of fear. He would remind us that the purpose is not deprivation, but transformation. To fast is to learn dependence, to confess weakness, to embrace the sufficiency of Christ in every part of life. And so the challenge is clear. Will we continue to live as though bread alone sustains us, or will we embrace the deeper truth that every breath, every moment, every strength we have is a gift from God? In the end, fasting is not about emptiness but about fullness, and it asks us to decide, which fullness do we desire? If the purpose of fasting is not deprivation but transformation, then the next question is, how exactly did Watchman Nee's approach differ from the common understanding of fasting? What was hidden in his method that made it both powerful and, in his eyes, dangerous to share too freely? Here we begin to uncover what might rightly be called the secret of his teaching. For most people, fasting is often reduced to a schedule. One sets aside a certain number of hours or days without food, hoping that the endurance of hunger will somehow translate into spiritual advancement. But Nee saw the inadequacy of this mechanical approach. He understood that without the right inner posture, fasting remains only an empty ritual, an exercise in willpower that can actually strengthen pride rather than weaken it. In other words, the act itself is not the secret. The secret lies in the heart and in the alignment of fasting with prayer, surrender, and revelation. He often spoke of the distinction between outward form and inward reality. Outwardly, a person may appear to be fasting, but inwardly they may be feeding on self-importance or secretly hoping for recognition. Outwardly, the body is denied bread, but inwardly the ego feasts on the idea of spiritual progress. Nee understood how subtle and deceptive the self can be, and it is precisely here that his hidden approach comes into view. Fasting in his teaching was not about suppressing hunger alone, it was about exposing the hidden currents of the heart. This is why he often paired fasting with silence and solitude. Without the distractions of food and without the noise of constant activity, a person quickly encounters themselves in a raw and unfiltered way. The irritability, the impatience, the sudden realization of how dependent we are on small comforts, all of this comes rushing to the surface. For many, this experience is unsettling, even unbearable. But for Nee, it was precisely here that breakthrough could occur. Because when the inner noise rises and the heart reveals its true condition, then, and only then, can the Spirit begin his deeper work. There was also a hidden rhythm in the way he approached fasting. He discouraged turning it into a fixed system, as though holiness could be measured in hours without food. He knew that human nature is quick to transform any discipline into a rule, and rules breed legalism. Instead, he encouraged a spirit-led practice, where the timing, the length, and the intensity of fasting were guided not by human ambition, but by divine prompting. In this way, fasting remained alive, dynamic, and relational. It became less about what the believer decided to do for God, and more about what God desired to do within the believer. From a psychological perspective, this makes profound sense. When fasting becomes rigid and mechanical, it appeals to the ego's need for control. It becomes another project to master, another achievement to add to the list of spiritual credentials. But when fasting is surrendered to the Spirit, it humbles the ego. It dismantles the illusion of control, forcing the believer to trust that even in weakness, God is at work. And this, perhaps, is the hidden dimension that Nee sought to protect, fasting as an encounter with power in weakness, not strength in self-effort. Philosophically, one could say that his approach exposes the fragile foundation of selfhood. Human beings often build identity on what they can do, achieve, or endure. But fasting, under the guidance of the Spirit, strips this away. It reminds us that we are not defined by performance, not even by religious performance. We are defined by our union with Christ. In this way, fasting becomes a revelation, not of our strength, but of our dependence, not of our ability to deny, but of God's ability to supply. It is telling that Nee rarely put these insights into writing for the general public. He understood that when misused, fasting can become a form of spiritual pride. Some might fast to gain influence, others to feel superior, still others to manipulate God into granting their requests. To give such a practice to the unprepared would be like giving a sharp sword to a child. This is why he revealed these insights only to those he discerned as genuinely hungry for God, those ready to approach fasting with humility rather than ambition. Stories from his disciples confirm this careful stewardship. They describe how he emphasized secrecy, urging them never to boast or even casually mention when they were fasting. To do so would rob the discipline of its power. The hidden practice, carried out in silence and humility, was the one that bore fruit. In this we can see the deep consistency of his message, that the most transformative spiritual realities are not performed on the stage of public recognition, but cultivated in the hidden chambers of the heart. And so we begin to glimpse the hidden aspect of his method. It was not merely about abstaining from food, but about entering a process of revelation. Fasting was a mirror, a test, a stripping away. It was a way to unmask the illusions of the self and to bring the believer face to face with the sufficiency of Christ. And because such exposure is both powerful and perilous, Nee guarded it carefully, entrusting it only to those ready to handle its weight. If we are to take this seriously, then the invitation to us today is not to copy a schedule or imitate a method, but to cultivate the inner posture that makes fasting fruitful. It is not the hours without food that matter, but the openness of the heart, the willingness to be exposed, the readiness to be changed. This is the true hidden secret, not the practice itself, but the heart behind it. And so we are left with a question. When all pretense is stripped away, when hunger exposes our hidden attachments, when silence confronts us with our true selves, will we resist and retreat, or will we allow God to transform us in that vulnerable place? The hidden secret of fasting is not found in the act, but in the surrender. If we have seen that fasting, for Watchman Nee, was not about ritual but revelation, not about deprivation but transformation, then the question naturally arises, what do we do with this in our own lives today? It is one thing to admire the hidden wisdom of a man who lived nearly a century ago. It is another thing entirely to take those principles and embody them in a modern context, in a world where speed, comfort, and distraction define our daily existence. The challenge is not to replicate his practice in exact detail, but to capture the spirit of it, to let the same principles shape our own spiritual journey. What, then, are the lessons we can draw? The first is that fasting must never be reduced to performance. In our world of social media, where every accomplishment is broadcasted, the temptation is stronger than ever to turn spiritual practices into public displays. But Nee was insistent. The power of fasting lies in secrecy, in the hidden life before God. If we fast to be seen, even subtly, then we have already lost the essence. The practice is emptied of its transforming power. So the first application is simple but demanding. Whatever fasting looks like for us, it must be done in silence, with the kind of humility that seeks no recognition. A second lesson is that fasting must be tied to prayer. Without prayer, it degenerates into a hunger strike, a mere test of willpower. Without prayer, hunger only irritates the flesh rather than refining the spirit. But when prayer is woven into the fast, the hunger becomes fuel for communion. Every pang becomes a reminder to turn inward, to seek the sustenance that comes from God alone. In this way, fasting trains the heart to redirect dependence. It teaches us to translate physical lack into spiritual abundance. And in a society obsessed with filling every void, whether through food, entertainment, or distraction, this redirection is a radical act of resistance. Third, Nee's approach teaches us that fasting is not about rigid schedules, but about surrender. We live in an age of programs and formulas where spirituality is often packaged into neat systems. But God resists being systematized. The Spirit moves as He wills, and fasting is powerful precisely when it is led by Him rather than by human ambition. This means that each of us must cultivate sensitivity. It may be that the Spirit leads us to fast for a day, or for a meal, or even for a longer season. What matters is not the duration, but the dependence. In following His prompting, we learn to let go of control, to release the ego's obsession with achievement, and to enter into a posture of obedience. From a psychological standpoint, this willingness to release control is transformative. Much of modern life is driven by the illusion of mastery. We think we control our schedules, our appetites, even our identities. But fasting reveals how fragile that control truly is. It strips away the illusion and forces us to confront dependence at its core. And in this confrontation lies freedom. When we can say with our whole being, man does not live by bread alone, we step into a new kind of security, one that cannot be shaken by circumstance, because it is anchored in God Himself. Philosophically, we might say that fasting reorients the human hierarchy. Most people live with the body in command, the soul in service to its cravings, and the spirit buried beneath. But fasting reorders this structure. It silences the tyranny of appetite. It calms the restless emotions, and it awakens the spirit to its rightful place of leadership. And when the spirit is in communion with Christ, the entire person is aligned with truth. In this sense, fasting is not simply a practice, but a restoration of order. It is a way of living rightly ordered in a disordered world. So what does this mean for us practically? It means that fasting is not just for the monks or mystics, not just for those in faraway lands or different eras. It is for us, for the student overwhelmed with distraction, for the professional consumed by ambition, for the parent stretched thin by responsibilities. Each of us, in our own ways, needs to rediscover the simplicity of dependence. Each of us needs moments where comfort is set aside so that communion can be prioritized. And fasting, in its essence, provides that opportunity. Watchman Nee's hidden teaching was never meant to remain hidden forever. He revealed it cautiously, yes, but he revealed it nonetheless because he believed that the church needed to recover this discipline. not as a ritual, not as a law, but as a pathway into deeper intimacy with Christ. His caution reminds us to handle it with reverence. His example invites us to step into it with courage. And so the final word is not about methods or schedules or rules. It is about desire. Do we hunger for God enough to set aside the lesser hungers? Do we long for His presence enough to strip away comfort, even briefly, to be filled with Him instead? That is the real question fasting forces us to face. It is not about what we give up, but about what we are willing to receive. If the outer man is broken, the inner man can be released. If the body is humbled, the spirit can rise. If the appetites are silenced, God can speak more clearly. This was the heart of Watchman Nee's teaching, and it remains just as urgent for us today. So the invitation is before us. Not to imitate his methods exactly, but to embrace the same posture, secrecy, prayer, surrender, desire. If we do this, fasting will cease to be a burden and will become a channel, a way for God's life to flow more freely in and through us. And here is the truth we cannot ignore. Fasting is not about what is lost, but about what is gained.